Today we're going to be talking about some common fractions, decimals, and percentages, and you'll notice that at the top it says to memorize these values. Eventually you will take a test or quiz where you're asked to come up with these memorized fractions, decimals, and percents, and just kind of know them. And so this is just one of those things. I'm going to give you some helpful tips as we fill this in today as to how to memorize them, and then I'm going to kind of give you just some time to go ahead and start memorizing. So the first fraction that we have halves. The first fraction is 1/2, and you may not know the decimal by heart, but the percentage, hopefully, you kind of already have an idea that 1/2 is the same thing as 50%, and our decimal is 0 5/10. So if you didn't know that already, the decimal is 0 5/10. The percentage is 50%. And then we can also have, instead of 1/2, we could have 2 halves. And we know that 2 halves is the same thing as 1 whole. If you picture that pictorially, you know, if you've got 2 halves, that makes 1 whole here. And then the percentage there is 100%. If we have a whole pie, we have 100% of the pie. And so the halves are where we start. This is kind of our base. 1/2 is 0 5/10, which is equal to 50%. 2 halves is equal to 1, which is also equal to 100%. For the thirds, we've got 0 33/100 repeating. The little bar above means that 3 goes on and on forever, so 0.33333. And the fraction that goes with this is 1/3. And the percentage that goes with this is 33 3/10 repeating percent. And so we've got 1/3 is equal to 0 33/100 repeating, which is then also equal to the percentage 33 3/10 repeating. And then we've got 2/3. 2/3 is just double 1/3, and so 2/3 is double 1/3, so 2/3 is 0 66/100 repeating, and then the percentage is 66 6/10 repeating percent. And then this last one, we've got 1/3, 2/3, so what would come next? It would be 3/3. 3/3 is just like 2 halves. 3/3 is equal to 1 whole, which is also equal to 100%. So notice that every time we have 1 whole, our number, or our decimal is 1, our percentage is 100. And then the fraction is just the same number over itself. So now when we come down to the quarters, or down to the fourths, we could kind of use patterns almost to start helping us fill some of these in. We've got 1/4 and 4/4, so in between here we're going to have 2/4 and 3/4. 1/4, 2/4, 3/4, 4/4. And now we're going to look at some decimals and percents. 1/4, think of it as 1/4, because 4 quarters make up $1. 1/4 or 1/4 is, the decimal is 0 25/100, which looks like 25 cents. And then that's also equal to 25%. Notice that when I'm writing my percentages, my percentage is just my decimal point moved 2 places to the right. So 2/4, if we reduced 2/4 here, we divided top and bottom by 2. If we did that, we would reduce to 1/2. So 2/4 is going to have the same decimal, same percentage as 1/2. So it's going to be 0 5/10 and 50%. And again, we can think of that as quarters. 2 quarters is equal to 50 cents, which is 50/100 is the same as 5/10. It's also 50% of $1. The next one we have is 3/4. Think about 3 quarters. 3 quarters is equal to 75 cents, so my decimal is 0 75/100. My percentage is 75%. Think about 75% of $1, or think about taking this decimal point and moving it 2 places to the right. And then this last one, 1 whole, think about this. If we've got 4/4, that's the same as 3/3 and 2/2. So my decimal is going to be the same as it was up here. It's going to be 1 whole. And my percentage is going to be the same as it was up here when it was 1 whole, which is 100%. The last step that we're going to do in this video is we're going to look at the fifths. And your fifths down here. Again, we can start to use some patterns to figure these out. The very first fraction they want us to fill in is 1/5. And if we look at our percentage, our decimal can actually come 2 places to the left from our percentage. So think about that decimal point being after the whole number 20, and then just moving it 2 places to the left, and that will give us our decimal, which is 20 hundredths, or 2/10 if you wanted to think of it as just 2/10. That's probably how it will be written on a test or quiz, is as 2/10. So I can even get rid of that 0 there and just make it 2/10. Then we've got 2/5, which is double 1/5. 1/5 times 2 is 2/5. So we've got 0 and 4/10. And then again, if we take that decimal and move it 2 places to the right, we get our percentage, which is 40%. 1/5, 2/5, 3/5, and 4/5. So 3/5 is equal to the decimal 0 and 6/10. And then my percentage, if I move the decimal 2 places to the right, I would get 60% as my percentage. 4/5 is equal to the decimal 0 and 8/10. And if I take that decimal and move it 2 places to the right, I get 80%, and so my percentage is 80. And then this last one's telling us that we have 1 whole, and we know that 1 whole is equal to 5/5. And then when we look up here at 1 whole, every time we have 1 whole, our percentage is always 100%. So far we've done halves, thirds, quarters, and fifths. And for halves, we talked about just kind of knowing those and understanding that 5/10 is the same thing as 1/2, and 50% is the same thing as 1/2. And then we talked about 2 halves being 1 whole, which is 100%, and that's just like 3/3, 4/4, and 5/5. They're all 1 whole, which is 100%. For the thirds, we talked about 1/3 being 33 hundredths repeating, and then moving that decimal over to get our percentage. And we talked about 2/3 being double that, so instead of 33 hundredths repeating, we've got 66 hundredths repeating, and then we moved our decimal 2 places over to get our percentage. Don't forget your repeating signs when you're doing this decimal or this percentage. For quarters, we talked about, when we're talking about fourths, we talked about thinking about quarters, 25 cents, 50 cents, 75 cents, $1, and then taking those decimals and moving the decimal 2 places to the right to give us our percentages. And then for the fifths, we talked through, these ones are kind of ones that I do recommend you just a little bit have them memorized, but 1/5 being 2/10 and 20%, and moving that decimal 2 places to the left to go from percentage to decimal, or taking our decimal and moving the decimal 2 places to the right to give us our percentage. And notice that this is 2/10, 4/10, 6/10, 8/10, and 1 whole. So 2, 4, 6, 8 is kind of the pattern here that you can use to help you remember your fifths. And then 20%, 40%, 60%, 80%, and 100%.